just want you to get a sense as to how important death was to Victorians. It's almost like they cherished death as much as they did life. It was just part of a process. You're born, you live a life, and you die. And they'd picnic with their loved ones in the cemetery. They pretty much it was just another day. They'd be with their loved ones in the cemetery on any nice spring or summer day. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do some walking. We're going to visit some of these residents, and we're going to tell you a few stories and tell you a few things about burial customs here during Victorian times especially. All right? So we're going to head that direction if you follow us. Now, we don't have to go very far before you can start to see a few symbolism pieces like finger pointing down. Now, sometimes you'll see a finger pointing down, sometimes you'll see a finger pointing up. It doesn't mean, well, this one's going to heaven, this one's going somewhere else. It just meant that maybe it was the Lord reaching for that individual to bring them to heaven. You also see a lamb on the headstone over there. Lambs signified a child. Anyone that hasn't reached maturity yet. So there is somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 individuals buried here. Just because you don't see a plot or you're walking around and you're walking maybe in between plots, that doesn't mean someone's not buried there. How many of you know where Sutter Middle School is in downtown Sacramento? That's where New Helvetia Cemetery was.
And they don't know if they actually got everybody out.
In the cemetery, there are only a few of these wooden headstones. This is the only one on this side of the cemetery. Most of them are way out on the back on the riverside side. Sometimes it was a case of the individual dying unexpectedly and not having anyone here to bury them, for one. Also, especially since this was a woman, and we know this because someone was dear enough to place a headstone here with her information on it, it was a case of maybe she didn't have the money. So wood headstones would have been carved with a name. And the wonderful thing about headstones in Victorian times is not only would they state when they were born, but not only when they died as far as the date, but how many days, how many months, all of it. The one wonderful thing about the city of Sacramento is everyone that arrived here prior to January 1850 was from somewhere else. And the gold rush was responsible for that. And that made you, prior to 1850, a pioneer of the state of California. And we do have a specific section just for the pioneers. So that's either somebody that arrived in California prior to or a descendant, that type of thing. And if you're wondering, they do not sell plots anymore. If you're related to someone buried here, you can be buried in the plot if there's room. If Georgia Fisher lived here in the 1870s, she met a tile cutter from the Netherlands. His name was Martin Bergman. And he and his brother ran a tile cutting company. So not only they manufactured the tile, but they also would cut it to fit whatever. This whole thing is the only one of its kind in the city cemetery, this monument. And Georgia and Martin got engaged. They were to be married. And about a week or so before their marriage was to take place, she got typhoid. And typhoid killed a lot of individuals. Now, I got to tell you something, just a little hint about Victorian doctors. I I use that term loosely a lot. It depended on who you were, how much money you had, that type of thing, and whether or not it was a legitimate doctor. And cholera killed somewhere between 850 and 1,000 people here in Sacramento in 1850. And then we had dropsy, which that's how they actually put it in burial records. Typhoid, typhus, any kind of heart ailment, they listed coronary thrombosis, this and that. So there were many different, and this is the wonderful thing about Victorian newspapers. If you died and you were murdered, they went into specific explanation as to how you died, where you died, how many times you were shot or stabbed or whatever. They weren't hiding the truth, and they weren't afraid of it. They just plainly said how it was. Anyway, Georgia, when she passed away, her fiance was extremely grief-stricken. So he decided to build this monument, which at one time, and it's very hard to see on the picture that's at the bottom here, at one time there was an angel, Gabriel or Michael, one of those two, statue hanging or suspended up from here. That was stolen a long time ago. But it's all specific tile, cut a specific way with a firing method not used anywhere else. And due to the fact that Martin and his brother left Sacramento not long after she passed away and they built this monument, they took all of those secrets with them. So there's no way anyone can, unless they find out whatever their firing method was. It's a very specific one. You can see there are angels in the relief here. There's two hands. Now, the hands on this represented who's accepting who into heaven. Sometimes it was the woman accepting the man into heaven. Sometimes it's the man accepting the woman. And whoever hand is on the outside is the one accepting. The other one is the one being accepted into heaven. So that was one piece of Victorian symbolism. Very powerful. So in this monument, even though it is deteriorating, which is very sad, a lot of it still remains, and you're welcome to take a look at the tile for a moment before we move on. It's an incredible piece of art and a wonderful way to honor a woman he was about to move. And you can see it says she was 19 years old, 10 months, and 2 days. This one, it had a drape over it, which was a sign not just of honor, but of sorrow.
So here we have Stephen Boutwell, and he was a farmer in Roseville. And there's a lot of Christian symbolism here. First of all, you have the scallop there, and that's it's a symbol of baptized in Christ. And then you also have the cross, and then a laurel wreath right there in front of the hanging on the cross. And the laurel wreath, if you think about it, was given to the victors in the original Olympics, and that was their crown to wear, and that was victory. And in Victorian symbolism, it's victory over death. Again, you know, a Christian term. And you'll actually see right here on the Crocker plot, she has a laurel wreath in her hand. And then we're going to move on up here. There's two more statues that have, one has a laurel wreath and one has the anchor. And the anchor is it's usually a symbol of an anchor of faith. These two gentlemen here were from Cortland. These two monuments right here, they were from Cortland. So just not everybody that's buried here came from was in Sacramento. We even have some people that lived in the foothills that are buried here, because this was the place to be buried in the mid to late 19th century. So we have Kercheval and Green. And Reuben Kercheval and Stephen Green, they were pear farmers down in Cortland. They were also, one was an assemblyman and the other was a city councilman. And they were neighbors, farmers, they were friends, but they were also competitors. And one day, one of them, I'm not sure which one, decided to go to come up to the city to purchase his plot here in the cemetery. And the other said, I think I'll go with you. So they came together, they bought their plots right next to each other, and they went on with their lives as farmers, as politicians, and then one of them passed away. And if you look, you could probably tell which one passed away first. Yeah. So that's Reuben Kercheval. He passed away first. So you know that Mr. Green was like, well, okay, so he's gone, so I can make you mine 6 feet taller.
And the interesting thing is 2017, we had a very bad storm in January. And you can just see the stump of where a tree was right over here. And that tree had big branches. One of those branches fell off and turned her. She used to face the same way as this one did. And after 100 years or so, she got tired of the view. Now she faces that way.
And we
It's a
like,
woman's prerogative to change her mind.
and we like to think that she's looking back on Cortland, because that's the direction of Cortland right there.
You remember how I told you that lambs signify a young person passing away? This is one family. This is their plot. And there are 6 lambs. The parents are James and Eliza Fountain, and these are their children. And I'm not really sure what happened to the head of that one lamb, but who knows? It doesn't look like it was just chopped off, but it could have been in antiquity. But once again, they're showing sorrow over the death of their children. And that was the best way to do so. And imagine you are parents of a family and 6 of your children. And this is the wonderful thing about Victorian families, is that they had 10 to 15 children usually. Because they had to make sure a few of them lived to be adults. Because someone's got to take care of mom and dad and grandma and grandpa when they get old. And so that was usually the goal. Or if they owned a business, someone had to take over the business so that they could retire. And childhood mortality rate in Victorian times was huge. It had to do with doctors, but a lot of times kids were working as well. And sometimes parents aren't even noticing that there's a really bad cough, or that they've inhaled asbestos, or who knows what. And next thing you know, they're dead. And if they have a bad cough, let's give them medicine with a 75% content alcohol in it, and that's going to shut that kid up, but it's not going to cure what made them sick to begin with. So unfortunately, that was one of the many things that happened at that time. And the wonderful thing, a lot of these doctors here in Sacramento started the California Medical Board and the American Medical Board. So they weren't all quacks, but there were an awful lot of them. And unfortunately, a lot of times illnesses were not caught right away. Or sometimes the parents were so busy working themselves, they didn't have an opportunity to do anything for their kids. Maybe not the money either.
And the age ranges are from about 2 years old to 21 years old.
89.
And 2 of them died from typhoid fever, 1 from cholera and phantom. And don't remember exactly what the other three passed away from, but today they would be all preventable.
Yeah.
So that would have been the area of Sacramento where most people would go during the 1850 flood. A gentleman buried right by the front gate. His name is Hart Bigelow. He was the first mayor of the city of Sacramento, and that's how he got to be mayor. I'll donate the money, you make me mayor.
So right here we have the Conrads, and I believe her name was Mary. Mary Conrad. This was her second husband, and her first husband that she received a divorce from is stated to be the first divorce in Sacramento. If you look here, so you have basically an obelisk shape, and then right in the middle, or at the pedestal of the obelisk, you'll see a compass and square. Does anybody know what the compass and square? Very good, very good. Sometimes you'll see a G in the middle of it. Does anybody know what the G means? Nope. Geometry.
All right, so before you go, I would also add to you that Samuel Conrad, her second husband, and she owned a big piece of property on the other side of the Sacramento River. It's now a place where Rayleigh Field is, or whatever field they call it now. They owned that whole area, which is now Washington, or was called Washington. Now it's Washington Unified School District, I think. But originally it was called Washington, and that was owned by the Conrads. And they came here during the gold rush, so they were original California pioneers.
So right here you'll see another column right here with the draping over it, and mostly that's considered the veil between the living and the dead. And you'll see it on top of urns, like Tina pointed out. A draped urn sometimes is a form of a sign of prominence, but it's also a sign of the veil between the living and the dead. And if in Christianity, you don't die. You just move on to your next life. And then you can also see over here you have another finger pointing down, and then you have an angel right here, which is very rare in the cemetery. We only have about 6 angels. Most Victorian cemeteries, you see an angel every 10 feet. But we only have about 6 to 8 angels here. And then we also have the dove here in the middle. The dove is a sign of peace, cleanliness, purity.
So I want to read just a little bit about some customs. Curtains would be drawn, clocks would be stopped, and any kind of draping would be done over mirrors. And that was to prevent the deceased spirit from getting trapped in the glass of the mirror. A wreath of laurel, yew, or boxwood, usually tied with crepe or black ribbons, was hung on the front door to alert passersby that a death had occurred. The body was watched every minute until burial, hence the custom of the wake. I heard people going to a wake, but the original reason was you wanted to make sure that that person was actually dead, because there were such a thing as comas and people coming out of the comas. That is why when they buried some folks, they thought they're dead. They put a string around their toe. The string goes through a hole in the ground, and a bell is tied to it. And that's where the term dead ringer came from. And in 19th century, the dead were carried out of the house, feet first. And that was in order to prevent the spirit from walking back in the house and beckoning another family member to join you. So grave robbery by the resurrectionist men, which I don't know if that's what they were all called, but grave robbers is what I always heard, were often doctors themselves, and there was a problem in the 19th century. In medical schools, there weren't enough cadavers to do instruction with. So they go into graveyards at night and they dig up the bodies. And the fear of a loved one being buried alive would also inspire coffin makers to design warning systems. And that was the other one. It wasn't just a dead ringer, it was saved by the bell if you happen to be alive.
William Caseberg was also a farmer up in Roseville, and the land from Washington Street all the way over to what is now Harding belonged to Stephen Boutwell, Kate Caseberg, and one other farmer, and they were basically one of the first co-ops up in Roseville. And as each member died, Stephen Boutwell was the first one to pass away, and then the other farmer passed away, and then everything went to Caseberg. And when he passed away, his son got it, and then his son broke it up. There's a Roseville Country Club up there, Roseville High School. Off of Washington, there is a mobile home park, and in the middle of that is a clubhouse, and that clubhouse used to be Caseberg's mansion, and it's still there. You can take tours of it, and they've got some history of it, but you know that right there is a pretty expensive monument for back then. So you know they were doing well, and at Foothill and Maine, there's the Caseberg Elementary School. So Roseville pays homage to the Casebergs, and especially all that land that was donated.
With a monument like that, is the person interred underground, or are they in that monument?
Usually in something like this,
Yeah,
they're underneath it.
Okay.
Sometimes you'll have the markers
This is
up
his actual
here.
headstone right here.
Yeah.
That was a monument to him.
Okay.
That's his actual headstone.
So just to look like a big mansion?
Yeah.
Hey,
So-
look who I was.
So you will see sometimes where they are underneath it, but yeah, like she points out,
Okay.
there's two here. We got one over here. A lot of these, when you have a large monument, you'll have several of them buried around it.
And remember what I said, just because you don't see a headstone doesn't mean no one's buried them.
Yeah.
Sometimes they sink into the ground. There's a million different reasons. Sometimes they're stolen. Sometimes they were mauled or disfigured or whatever
Or
they caused,
our trees fall during storms and knock them over.
which happened
We've got
quite recently. Anchor usually had several different meanings. Either they were the leader of their family, or their life was anchored in the faith of Christianity or whatever was their religion. But that's what an anchor usually stood for. And it could be a woman with an anchor, usually because, just like Troy said, the virtues, going back to the fact that Victorians paid a lot of homage to Greek and Roman and Egyptian, not just architecture, but also mythology and beliefs. But you can see some of the births were in the 1800s, some of them were in the 1900s. So this is several generations.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, here's Horace.
Oh, wow.
Pretty prolific family.
Is this the Mark Hopkins family?
No. Mark Hopkins is way.
He's over in the Pioneer section.
Got it.
He actually has the largest mausoleum in the cemetery. That's only because his wife wanted it that way.
Okay, I'm showing you this not really because of anything other than most monuments are made of marble or granite. This one is made of bronze. This was actually made by the Detroit Bronze Company, and it was made in the 1800s because this gentleman that it's for actually died in 1875, and they were coated in zinc, and the zinc helped the material of the bronze to weather well. And it's really cool because there's one side that's got no wall to it. Kind of creepy.
And you can see, even though it was a bronze, it still had a lot of symbolism on here. You have the veil over here.
Draping for
Over here, you
sorrow.
have a laurel wreath.
Flowers. Flowers for sign of beauty. You'll see a lot of headstones with large trees, kind of like a weeping willow. And that had several different meanings. It could have meant that that person lived a long life, a rich, long life. It also could have meant that he left a long legacy or some type of legacy with his family to carry on. But they will be etched differently on different headstones. And we've done Masonic tours in the past. We've actually had some past Grand Commanders in the state of California here too, in full grand regalia, talking about everything that the Masons have done. That's for another time. I hope I get to do one more before I leave.
So you see some of the ironwork around these. Looks like it's relatively new. It's not. It's just been painted.
Only son, he was aged 1 year, 3 months, 25 days. So that's another version of the lamb.
Not all the information on headstones is the same across the board. Here you have erected by George Newcomb, and that may be because Ben Adams here had no one else, had no family here or anything, and that may have been his best friend, and he put it up there for him. And here's a good example. There are quite a few people that are buried in this plot, but they're not related to him.
And there's also no headstones for them.
So here we have a cross with ivy and a pile of rocks. The rock is Peter. You know, the church is built on the rock of Peter. The ivy. How many of you have ivy in your backyards
Or your front yards or anywhere.
or anywhere,
Yeah.
or you've had to deal with ivy once in your life? You try to get rid of it, it comes back, right? So ivy is the best symbolism for eternal life. So here we have the Davis family, and Jerome Davis. He came here during the Bear Flag Revolt, and right after the Mexican-American War, or during the Mexican-American War, and he came here with John C. Fremont, and he was a private at the time, and his company commander was Captain Childs. And Captain Childs had a very striking daughter, and Jerome Davis was kind of smitten for her. And they lived on the yellow side of the Sacramento River, and he lived on the Sacramento side. Excuse me, a little parched. So in order for him to go and visit her, he would have to pay a toll for a ferry to go across the river. And she must have been worth it, because he was spending about $16 a day to go see her. When he finally got out of the army and he started a dairy farm on the yellow side, he decided that what he was going to do was buy out the ferry that used to transport him back and forth and make him the only one that was doing it. So he would also, if you wanted to buy any of his produce, you would first have to get on the ferry to come across and buy his produce. So you had to pay to come across, you had to pay to get his produce, and then guess what? You had to pay to get back. So he and Childs' daughter, they they got married. They had a child, a daughter, and at the farm that they had, there was a conveyor belt, and Jerome and his daughter were playing on it, and she fell off, and she hit her head, and she died instantly. And this is her right here. Now,
Another lamb.
Jerome's dad, Isaac, owned a bunch of land over there as well in Yolo. And when Isaac passed away, it was deeded to Jerome. Well, Jerome decided he didn't need all that land, and he gave it to the county of Yolo, and it became the city of Davis. Now, if you listen to what the captain's name was Childs.
Oh, yeah.
You have Childs Road, and then eventually that land also became part of UC Davis. So Jerome Davis is the namesake for the city of Davis here.
Interesting.
Egypt, you had tombs. Europe and the United States, you had mausoleums. Mausoleums usually were built by somebody who was of wealth. And this particular individual that built this mausoleum, which cost $16,000 in 1870s money, was a woman. I'm not going to say she was one that made it her living on her back. Her sister was a known horizontal expert of sorts. Her name was Fanny Seymour. That was not even their real name, but that was the wonderful thing about being born somewhere else and coming here during the gold rush. You have one identity where you grew up, then you come here and you assume a whole other identity. So we had Fanny, whose real name was Sarah Brown, and Mary Brown, who became Mary McCormick, Mary Wilson, Mary Smith. She was married several times. Husband number 4, she was married to, and she was afraid he was trying to poison her and kill her, so she moved back in with husband number 3, and she ended up dying of coronary thrombosis in 1879. But prior to her death, she purchased this plot. She had several children, both of them died before her. And several husbands are buried here, friends, relatives. And she ran a business called the Palace Hotel. Most people called her Crazy Mary. She's my favorite. She's one of my interpretive characters, put it that way. And she was only 49 years old when she passed away. And it has Frances Brown, Maggie Brown. Yeah.
These trees that are flanking the street here are called mourning cypresses. That's MOURNING. And then they lead their way down to the funeral chapel there.
To keep the records for the cemetery, all the burial indexes in there. Then that roof leaked, so they started keeping them up there. That place was not considered a climate control place. Now they are in the Center for Sacramento History, and that is where they will remain. That is all World War I, World War II veterans. You don't see any headstones because they're all flat headstones. I recommend if you ever have the chance, go down there and take a look. We do have a Tuskegee Airman buried there.
In the section right to the left of it, there's a Medal of Honor recipient there from the Civil War. He was in the Navy. And there's also some of the New Helvetia burials there, a mass grave there.
And we're going to head up this way, but before we do, I want to point out a headstone to you that is the only one of its kind in the cemetery, very much like George's picture.
Oh, wow.
Harry Snow was the Sacramento attorney. He was involved in several landmark cases. He was only 26 years old when he passed away, and his co-workers, those who his fellow legal comrades, decided he needed to have a very special headstone because he cherished the law. and they made this headstone the way it is. Once again, it's curled up at the bottom because that's not a complete life. And I'm really not sure what's etched on there, but it's very interesting that they would take the time to do this for him.
It's made out of marble.
You see IOOF, the International Order of Odd Fellows, on a building, just like a Masonic hall, it will have the compass and square. Same thing with Odd Fellows, and you could be an Odd Fellow and a Mason. And again, another fraternal organization, and I can tell you this, my great-great-grandfather was one, and other than that, I've been approached about joining Job's daughters. But I'm going to tell you that at this period of time in history, if you were a Mason and you passed away, your wife and children never ever had to worry about a place to live, clothing on their backs, or food in their stomachs. The other Masons would make sure of it. They took care of their own. If you go to a Masonic lodge, or I know for certain with Masonic lodge, the back end of the building usually has a school for the blind and a school for the deaf. Some of the most prominent landmarks in United States history were built and donated by the Masons.
This is the original Masonic lawn right here. And just as with the military, generally you're going to have very modest headstones. You'll obviously have the compass and square. Sometimes you'll have some dramatic pieces on it. This row right here, the tall one at the very back, is another one of the angels. This one, although, is the angel of death. So this tall one here is John Bigler, and he was the third governor of California. And they actually named a lake, an alpine lake, for him. And it was called Lake Bigler for quite a while, up until about 1946. And then they changed it back to its original indigenous name,
Tahoe.
which was Tahoe. But straight behind him, there is almost all the way to the end of this lawn.
Looks like 2 blocks.
It looks like 2 square blocks, and it's very, just very plain. On the back side of it says "A Friend of Liberty," and he was one of the first practicing doctors here. And his name was Charles Duncombe. He was born in New York in 1792, and when he became a doctor, he moved to Upper Canada, and he's actually started the first school of medicine in Canada. Made his way in with some French fur traders and did a few other odd jobs until he heard about gold. And he came here. He was able to assist with the cholera outbreaks. And in 1867, he was down in his home, down in Hicksville, and he passed away from heat stroke. You would think a doctor would know better than to put himself out there where he could gain heat stroke. Does anybody know where Hicksville is?
There's actually still a road there named Hicksville Road.
And there's a Hicksville Cemetery too. It's the town of Galt.
In this city cemetery, we have 2 other governors buried here. We have the 11th governor of California, who was Newton Booth. His building is still at the corner of Front and J Street, called Booth and Company. That was his business. And the other one is William Irwin, and he has, probably for the governors here, the largest monument, and that's in the state plot that's over there. You can see the woman here. She is standing next to a column that's been cut off. That was a sign of a life cut short. So most likely her husband or maybe his sister, and he died at the age of 34. His name was David Pinkham, and death cannot sever what love has made eternal, is what is written
There.
or etched at the bottom. Probably the most romantic thing written on any of these headstones in this cemetery to me. Big, tall, grandiose thing with the wreath over there, that's the first documented burial in the city cemetery, the one I was telling you about in 1849, Thomas Homans. But I'm going to tell you about someone much more interesting. Her name was Maria Rupp, and she was born in Germany, came to the United States in 1856. You got to remember, at this particular period of time, women don't have a lot of employment opportunities, but she got a job running a saloon. It was called the Sacramento Beer Saloon. It was on K Street between 3rd and 4th, so underneath that god-awful thing that you guys all called high pipe. So, according to the Sacramento Daily Union, which was the only newspaper around in 1856 that was daily, okay, Sacramento Bee didn't come along until 1857. She was absolutely beautiful. Not only was she beautiful on the outside, but she could sing and she could play the piano. And if you're coming into that saloon on any given night, you're going to hear one Stephen Foster song after another. Camptown Races, Oh Susanna. And that's going to make you sing more. That's going to make you want to buy more booze. And that's how the Sacramento Beer Saloon made a lot of money. Now, there was one man in town that instantly saw her and fell in love with her. His name was Francois Noisette, and he was a doctor here in Sacramento. He sees her. Probably doesn't take long for them to fall in love, and he asks her to marry him. Now, everybody knew that Francois is engaged to Maria, but there's always one fly in that ointment. His name was Peter Metz. He was a local carpenter here in Sacramento, but he was kind of weird. Walked around, talked to himself, saw things that nobody else could see, most likely. Most people just thought, that's just Peter being Peter. Until he makes the statement that he is in love with Maria. He wants to marry her and help her run the Sacramento Beer Saloon. Well, one of his acquaintances tells him, can't marry her. She's already engaged to be married to Francois the doctor. Back then, an engagement is a binding contract. Betrothal, they called it back then. And his friend tells him, you can't marry her. She's already engaged to somebody else. Well, that enraged him. Peter Metz says, if I can't marry her, no one else will. On the night of November 18th, 1857, Maria's in the saloon. She's playing the piano. Everyone's singing along and drinking and singing and drinking. And in walked Peter Metz with a butcher knife. Everyone's singing and drinking and having a good time. Didn't pay attention. Still singing and drinking, singing and drinking. He sits down on the piano bench next to her, puts his arm around her, and takes that knife and shoves it right into her right breast and into her spleen. She bled out about 15 minutes later. So there's a lot of people in this saloon. There's no way that Peter Metz could say, I didn't do that. Probably said, look what I did. I stopped her from marrying that other man. And this is, of course, even done in the state of California. Very long trial afterwards, trying to determine was he insane at the time he committed the crime. Well, he was found guilty, and guess what? California just built a brand new prison in 1854 or 1855 called San Quentin. He was one of their most notorious murderers. So he gets there. He was actually, by the time that our illustrious 11th governor of California was seeking re-election, he was their longest serving inmate. He's made several pleas for release. He's been a model prisoner. But before I go on with that, I want to tell you a little bit about what happens. Maria's dead. 23 carriages of flowers, all the way from where the Sacramento Beer Saloon is, all the way here to the city cemetery, to this plot, which is her plot. Everyone's mourning, everyone's in grief. Then there's the situation of Francois Noisette. He's a doctor. Most doctors at this time made legal wills that if something happened to them and they died, especially unexpectedly, that their innards and anything on their person could be donated to science. Well, they say, and none of us has dug it up, so we don't know. They say that he made a stipulation that the rest of his body could go to science, but his heart was to be buried next to Maria. He only outlived her by 4 years, and it's in French. It says, "My heart is with Maria, Francois Noisette." It is two different cups. It is the cuff of a woman's blouse accepting the cuff of a man's shirt into heaven. Again, a cross that is pretty tall, pretty heavy. By the time that the city cemetery committee was originally established, they had paid for the funding for this big iron fence to be all around the cemetery back in the 1980s. They couldn't find this. They had seen pictures, but they couldn't find it. It was gone. It had all sunk into the earth. And so they had to dig it out. They put it on this foundation. And on the back is an angel statue, no hands. And my theory is, once she couldn't play music anymore, she didn't need the hands. But it's anyone's guess. So that is the story of Maria Rupp, one of the earlier female murders here in the city of Sacramento. And what an interesting way to show love and honor to her. So all the people buried here were either volunteer firemen, especially in the early days when we had one fire after another. All you need is someone to go asleep with an oil lamp burning. Next thing you know, it's knocked over and your business goes up in flames. Or some of the children that died in the fire without a family to bury them. There are sections in the cemetery going back that direction where you can see what area of Northern California the bricks came from, because they didn't all come from Sacramento. Also, I challenge all of you to find where Wyatt Earp's nephew is buried. He's buried here in the cemetery. The youngest son of Alexander Hamilton is buried in this cemetery. One of the Donner Party survivors, and I'm just going to say that, is buried in our city cemetery. And we have Medal of Honor recipients. We have a Tuskegee Airman that I told you about. They're all buried here. It all takes all of you to do the investigating. We do have a lot of other tours coming up that might touch on some of these people.
They're buried here because they died here?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it was a case of that. Alexander Hamilton's son, William Stephen Hamilton, was here during the gold rush, and he was here in 1850. Guess what's happening in Sacramento in 1850? Cholera, and that's what he died of. I hope you have an opportunity to come back here to one of our tours in the future. Our next tour is in September. September, we're doing...
Did you know?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, did you?
Did you know?
Yeah, and it's going to touch on anything and everything, including a few of those folks that we talked about. I hope you all fall in love with this place like we have. It's hard not to. And we want to thank you for coming on our tour, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Be safe out there. Don't want to end up in a place like this too soon.
No. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.